Hello. Welcome. This is Getting Started with Lightning Navigation. I'm Andrew Huffman, and I'll be guiding you through the new navigation APIs. So before we get started, just a quick note that you should base your purchasing decisions on products and services that are currently available. So again, I'm Andrew Huffman. I'm lead software engineer for the Lightning Application Framework team. I've been at Salesforce for almost a year now. It's the first time I've been at Dreamforce, so it's pretty exciting. Ikshatha is sitting up here in the front row. She's our product manager. I don't think we'll have time for questions at the end, but you can come and talk to us if you have questions afterward. So let's get into it. So some background. You've probably never heard of the Lightning Application Framework, at least I hope you haven't. But I want to give some understanding of why this team had to be created. So Lightning is a single-page app. This means that once the page is loaded, all the subsequent navigations are handled entirely within the browser. And by that, within the browser, I mean the JavaScript code within the browser. The browser must do all the work. That means determining which component should be displayed when for a particular URL and swapping out the old component for the new component, and also even managing the browser history. You may have noticed that we recently removed the hash mark. The hash was then followed by like a segment. That's been replaced with what looks like a real URI using the history API. So given all this, it's required us to create a general navigation service that can handle navigations to any Lightning page. And the way we've done this is that we've centered it around a concept called page references. And you may have heard of page references before in the context of Visualforce. This is not the same thing. We just borrowed the same name, aside from the fact that it has to do with the page. So let's get into what you can do. You can navigate with the Lightning Navigation APIs. This is simply the resolution of a component from a URL or a page reference. You can programmatically navigate using our API. With this API, you can also manipulate the browser history using a replace parameter. And in order to use this, you would include this Lightning navigation component. You can also generate URLs using page references. And this will allow you to be able to reliably generate URLs instead of you handcrafting them. And this is also provided by the Lightning navigation component. We also allow you to bind your component to the current page context. This means obtaining the page reference for the current page. This way you don't have to go into the URL and try to figure out what the record ID is and what the action is and that sort of thing. You can just implement this Lightning has page reference interface, and we will set the page reference onto your component when it's displayed. You can also use this to carry state on from one page to the next using the query parameters. This is persisted in the state. The page reference state is persisted in the URL as query parameters, and this is something you can use to support deep linking. What we call deep linking is the ability to navigate directly to a particular subview or some sort of non-standard view for your component. And finally, we have URL addressable components. So some of you may be using navigate to component. This is a more formalized definition of how to navigate to a particular component. With a navigate to component, it's a base64 encoding of the code. It can be like 1,000 characters long if you send a link to somebody else. So this is much more like human readable way of handling this. And it also will support the page context interface. And if you want to implement this, you would implement the Lightning is URL addressable interface. So some background. So before the navigation service, in order to go to a certain page, you had to fire an event. And for each different page, we had different events. And obviously, over time, this doesn't scale. It also doesn't give us a way to really correspond anything to the URL. It's just kind of arbitrary. So in order to solidify this and consolidate it into a single API, we created Lightning Navigation. In a Lightning Navigation, we have two methods. Generate URL, it takes in a page reference and returns a promise that will resolve on the URL. with the URL that that page reference maps to. And there's navigate, which takes in a page reference and an optional Boolean parameter for history replacement. And this is something you can use for various scenarios like redirection and other cases where you don't want to clutter up the history. So what does this look like? Previously, if you wanted to navigate to a particular record, you had to obtain the navigate to S object event, set the record ID on it, and then fire it. What you'll do now is you'll include the Lightning component into your HTML. You'll reference it through an order ID. In this case, I call it nav service. And then you'll simply call navigate on it. And in this case, I am setting it a standard record page reference with the record ID is the same. But in this case, we've added a new attribute called action name. This will allow you to drill down into a particular action. So there's view, there's edit. There might be others depending on the page reference. So I've talked a lot about page references, but haven't really dove into it too much. It's simply an object literal, just a standard JavaScript object. We use it to convert the URL into something structured that can be reused, and it's something that you can rely upon. It allows you to not have to parse the URL. And it's what we use inside the Lightning and the framework and the routing framework. So if you're using events, we're end up translating it into page references anyway underneath the covers. It's also consumed by ours as well as console APIs. There may be others, or there could be others in the future. So you definitely want to be using page references so that you can ensure your code can be usable in other scenarios. This object has three properties: type, attributes, and state. Type is just the type of the page. Attributes are the information that will actually be stored in the URL, so like record ID, the view, and state. State is an optional set of parameters that will be tacked on to the URL as a query string. So I've kind of spoken about this in the abstract, but I want to show you a concrete example. So the URL is made up of the domain, Lightning prefix, and then this next section, the /o, corresponds with the type of the page reference. In this case, it's an object page. The next segment, account, corresponds with the object API name. And this last segment here, list, corresponds with the action name. So this takes you to the account list page. This last section, the query parameters, is stored in the state of the page reference. So we have 7 page references that we publicly support. I'm not going to go into too much detail on these, but you can notice in the URL paths there, in the brackets, for instance, component name for Lightning component, that is an attribute in the page reference that's required. For these, for like record page and record relationship page, we support multiple URL patterns. So if you don't want to have to know that an account, or to tack onto the page reference that an account page is an account page, a record page for an account is an account, you can just omit that and it's okay, we'll rewrite it anyway. Okay, so I have a demo here, an app that I created. It's for mascots. There's not too much. Let's see if I can. I guess not. Okay, I have to look at the screen over here. So this app is fairly simple. We have this launch page. This is just a page that allows you to go into the other aspects of the app. We have just a standard contacts page here, and I have this mascots page. And so mascots is a custom object. This is a Lightning component tab override, and let's see. Let me get back to the right here. So I'm going to use this app as context for stepping through the various APIs. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the Navigate API. This is the API that allows you to go from one page to the next. The way this looks from your standpoint, we have a page reference here. For instance, if you want to go to contacts page, simply set an on-click handler that does the navigate to, and it'll go there. So all the buttons that I have in this app are using navigate the navigate method in the navigate service. It's pretty straightforward. You can also do you can do deep linking with it. So this is the ability to set a particular state on the page reference and navigate into that. So for instance, if I just want to get to just the mascots list view, what I can do is set the filter name here to the record ID of the list view. And then when I go to here, I'll get just the mascots view. You can also do a redirection. So with this mascots page, what I have here is the ability to drill down into a specific mascot. So I pass along in the state a view state with the record ID of the mascot. What happens when you go to mascots, this is the tab action override. It detects that parameter existed and then forwards you to this, to the card for that specific mascot. If you go back to the launch point. You don't go back to the mascot's home. This is because I passed in replaced equals true when I did that navigation. So what does this look like? You need to bring in the Lightning navigation component and tack onto it an ID. In this case, I call it nav service. Then reference that through a component find. And then you can call it with the page reference and optionally with the replace parameter. We also have the generate URL API. So I'm going to show you here with the, you can barely see the checkbox. There it is. So each of these buttons I have associated with it a page reference. And then using the generate URL API, I'm generating this. So if I make a change, and as I showed you with the page reference, if I make a change to like the filter name here, for instance, that updates the URL immediately. In the case of navigating to a different record, I change this record ID, it's updating this segment of the URL. So what you can do with this, you can future-proof your app. So if you're handcrafting your URLs, there's potential that could break in the future. You also might be using Aloha URLs or other things that might be a little bit slower in redirecting the users to the right page. So by using the generate URL API, what you can do is just be ensured that these links will not break, and that if we make any changes or enhancements in the future, you'll be able to incorporate that into your app. One important thing to note is you can create user-friendly links. So if you're using events, and so your options are either to use an event on like a link or to handcraft your URL before. So if you're firing an event within like an anchor, users aren't able to right-click and copy the URL. If they do that, it's probably going to be JavaScript void or something, because there is actual no href in there. You're doing an on-click and then firing an event. So you really should be using the generate URL API in order to generate links that users can say command click and open up in a new tab, or right click and be able to grab the URL directly, maybe send it to a colleague. That way users can have a better experience with your app. So in order to do this, it's very much similar to the Navigate API. You simply bring in the nav service, or the Lightning navigation component, and reference it through its OR ID. In this case, you should also have a attribute. In this case, I called it URL. And then in the initialization handler, you'll set that attribute when the promise resolves. And that will get referenced in this formatted URL component, which will then display it as a link. Now, the reason I'm using Lightning formatted URL here instead of a regular anchor is because if you use regular anchors, it's not actually, as I mentioned in one of the first slides there, it's a single-page app, but the browser doesn't know that. So when you click on that link, it's going to go back to the server and retrieve the page. So if using regular anchors and navigating to your URL, it's going to be a lot slower. So instead, you should use something like format URL, and that one underneath the covers be calling into our APIs and doing the transitions within the client. So I want to go into what you can do with page context. So this is available in Lightning Component Overrides. It's available in Lightning Component Tabs and a few others I'll go into. So in this list view of the mascots, you can see it's a set of cards. They're in the order that I added them, so they're not in any particular alphabetical order. What I've added here is the ability to sort them, so you can sort it in ascending or descending order. And what you'll notice is that when I do ascending, it updates the query parameter up here to direction ascending. And if I do descending, of course it does descending. And what this allows you to do is be able to link back to it link back to it in other places in your app, or in maybe a bookmarkable link and that sort of thing. You can also use this to pass page state along from one component to the next. So in this example that I had with the redirection, I'm passing along this view method ID to the mascot's card. So that's handled through the mascot's home view. So this is like two different components that are kind of communicating through each other using the query parameters. So you can imagine that if you have like a wizard flow or something like that, you might be able to pass along data from one page to the next using page state. As I mentioned before, you can, of course, this allows users to be able to bookmark particular pages or particular views of the page, and deep linking. And there's also URL adjustable components that's kind of built into this. So I didn't mention it before, but these cards here, each of these cards has a button that will take you to it, that same component, but standalone. And this component is, if you look at the URL here, I can barely see. Where is it? There it is. CMP C mascot card. So the name of my component is called mascot card. And what it does is when you navigate directly to it, it has a page reference. So if on the mascot homepage here, it has no page reference. But when it's on here, it has a page reference. It knows then that it was navigated to directly. And so it then expects this mascot ID to exist so that it can go out to the server and retrieve that information. So in order to use this, you need to implement has page reference in your component. This will set the page reference attribute for you, and it'll also update it for future transitions. So it's important that you have a change handler on this so that you can react to any changes, page changes. You only get initialized with the page reference once. After that, it'll just be updated. It's available in Lightning Component tabs, action overrides, and utility bar items. For URL addressable components, it's pretty much exactly the same. Oops, there we go. URL addressable components is pretty much exactly the same. You need to, instead, though, implement Lightning is URL addressable. I wanted to show you here that URL pattern changes from the base64 encoded URL pattern to this more user-friendly /CMP/ component name. All right, so with the last minute I have, I'm going to talk to some takeaways and tips. So you should stop using the navigate to events. Start using the navigate API through the Lightning navigation. You should stop hard coding your URLs. You should use generate URL. You don't want links to break in the future. You also want to use something like Lightning formatted URL instead of traditional anchors, so that you can ensure that the page transitions occur within the browser instead of going back to the server and coming back. You also want to stop parsing the URL. You should implement has page reference instead, and then you can just access the information that's in that URL through that. You should stop using navigate to component and instead use standard component page reference type. You'll have more human-readable URLs. You'll also be able to react to page reference changes. And also, I want people to really take advantage of this feature, really push the bounds on it, because I think that being able to handle your own navigation, your own components, you can really kind of control the flow of your app. So I'm excited to see what people come up with. And you should also consider supporting deep linking and bookmarkable state by taking advantage of the state attribute in the page reference. And I think I'm out of time. Yep. All right. Thank you.